Ambassador David Kellner stared at his gravity boots with the kind of betrayed expression usually reserved for ex-lovers and malfunctioning coffee machines. The left one had been making a peculiar whirring sound for the past 3 minutes, while the right one seemed determined to pull him toward what appeared to be a decorative fountain that defied every law of physics he'd learned in basic academy training. "Sir, perhaps if you adjusted the magnetic compensation." Sarah Martinez, his cultural attaché, began nervously, her holographic notes flickering like a dying campfire in the Zephyrian atmosphere. "Sarah, I've been adjusting magnetic compensation since we left the shuttle," David muttered, taking another cautious step forward on the crystalline walkway that stretched between the floating spires of the Zephyrian capital. These boots were supposedly calibrated for any gravitational environment in the known galaxy. Apparently, whoever designed them never met a planet that considers gravity more of a suggestion than a law. Below them, the city of Lithara sparkled in the amber light of twin suns, its bioarchitectural marvels pulsing with patterns of light that seemed to breathe. The walkway beneath his feet hummed with a low frequency that made his fillings ache, and David wondered not for the first time why humans insisted on conducting diplomacy in environments that seemed specifically designed to make them look ridiculous. "The ceremonial protocols indicate that we should." "Oh no, not again." Sarah's voice cracked as her holographic display stuttered and transformed her carefully researched notes into what appeared to be a recipe for something called quantum stew. The electromagnetic interference from the living city played havoc with Earth technology, turning their most sophisticated equipment into expensive paperweights with attitude problems. David reached for the railing, which immediately began glowing a soft blue at his touch, apparently interpreting his grip as some form of greeting. The light traveled along the biometal surface, creating ripples that would have been beautiful if he hadn't been desperately trying not to plummet into the anti-gravity fountain below, which was now making what sounded distinctly like chuckling noises. "Is that fountain laughing at me?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "According to my notes when they were working, Zephyrian architecture incorporates emotional resonance. The city responds to the feelings of its inhabitants." Sarah paused, consulting her sputtering device. "It might be, amused by your struggle with the gravitational fields." "Wonderful, I'm being mocked by urban planning." They continued their careful progress toward the central spire, where the welcoming ceremony would take place. David had attended dozens of first contact protocols, but nothing had prepared him for a civilization that treated physics like a casual acquaintance rather than a fundamental law. Around them, Zephyrian citizens glided effortlessly through the air, their elongated ears twitching with what he was beginning to recognize as suppressed amusement at the Earth delegation's clumsy navigation. The palace entrance materialized before them, literally. One moment they faced a smooth wall of living crystal, the next, an archway of flowing light welcomed them inward. David stepped through and immediately felt his gravity boots recalibrate with a sound like a confused robot sneezing. "Welcome, Ambassador Kellner." A voice spoke directly into his mind, causing him to jump and accidentally activate his boots' emergency stabilizers. He found himself suspended 3 feet off the ground, rotating slowly like a disoriented planet. The Zephyrian Greeting Committee observed his predicament with the polite interest of beings who had long ago evolved past the need for such crude solutions to gravitational challenges. Their leader, a tall figure whose ears seemed to shimmer with their own internal light, stepped forward. "I am Chancellor Thyron. We have prepared the ceremonial chamber for your visit." Thyron's mental voice carried undertones of what David suspected was cosmic patience. "Perhaps your mobility assistance devices require adjustment to our environment." "They're working perfectly," David replied with as much dignity as someone spinning in midair could muster. "This is exactly how we intended to make our entrance. Very dynamic." Sarah fumbled with her control pad, trying to bring him down without activating the boot's combat protocols, which would probably interpret the peaceful Zephyrian delegation as a threat requiring immediate evasive action. After several tense moments, David's feet touched solid ground with a gentle thump that echoed embarrassingly through the crystalline chamber. The ceremonial hall stretched before them, its walls pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that shifted like aurora trapped in living glass. The air itself seemed to hum with harmonious frequencies that made David's bones resonate in ways that weren't entirely unpleasant, though they did make him want to clear his throat constantly. Zephyrian nobles lined the pathways, their elegant forms draped in garments that appeared to be woven from solidified light. Their ears, David noticed, were remarkably expressive, twitching, rotating, and tilting in what seemed to be a complex form of nonverbal communication. He made a mental note to add ear reading to his diplomatic skill set, right after, not falling over in alien gravity fields. "The Queen approaches," Thyron announced, and the chamber's lighting shifted to deeper, more reverent tones. David straightened his formal diplomatic coat, which had somehow managed to twist during his aerial misadventure, and tried to project an air of competent professionalism. The harmonics in the air swelled, creating a melody that sounded like starlight given voice, and through a shimmering portal of liquid light stepped Queen Lysara. Even prepared for the ethereal beauty of the Zephyrian royal bloodline, David found himself momentarily breathless. She moved with the fluid grace of water-given form, her elongated ears catching the ambient light and reflecting it in subtle prismatic patterns. Her garments seemed to be cut from the fabric of space itself, dark and shot through with points of captured starlight. "Ambassador Kellner," her voice resonated both aloud and in his mind, creating a harmony that made his spine tingle. "Welcome to Lithara. We hope your journey from Earth was smooth." David opened his mouth to deliver his carefully prepared diplomatic greeting, then noticed the way Queen Lysara's lips twitched slightly at the corners, and the barely perceptible twitch of her ears that suggested she was fighting not to smile. She had clearly witnessed his undignified entrance. "Your Majesty," he began, then decided honesty might serve better than pretense. "The journey was smooth, the landing less so. I'm beginning to suspect your gravity has a sense of humor." The Queen's ears definitely moved at that, rotating forward in what he hoped was interest rather than offense. Around the chamber, he could see other Zephyrian ears similarly oriented toward him, like elegant satellite dishes tuned to pick up his next diplomatic blunder. "Our physicists have noted that consciousness influences our gravitational fields," Queen Lysara replied, and David was certain now that she was suppressing amusement. "Perhaps your expectations of difficulty created a feedback loop with our planetary systems. So you're saying I manifested my own clumsiness through quantum entanglement with your planet's sense of humor. That is one interpretation." David found himself genuinely smiling for the first time since arriving on Zephyr. "Your Majesty, I think I'm going to enjoy our diplomatic relations." The Queen's ears tilted in what seemed like pleased surprise, and for just a moment the regal composure slipped enough to reveal something more genuine underneath. Curiosity, perhaps, and maybe the faintest hint that she, too, might enjoy what was to come. The diplomatic reception unfolded in what David could only describe as controlled chaos, disguised as elegant sophistication. The bioluminescent walls of the great hall pulsed in rhythm with conversations, creating an ever-shifting light show that would have been mesmerizing if it hadn't been giving him a mild headache. His translator implant buzzed occasionally, clearly struggling with concepts that didn't exist in human language. "Ambassador, you simply must try the crystallized essence of temporal joy," declared Minister Vexthala, a dignified Zephyrian whose ears seemed to be decorated with tiny floating jewels that orbited in lazy patterns. She held out what appeared to be a small, glowing cube that hummed with its own frequency. David accepted the offering cautiously, His briefings had mentioned that Zephyrian cuisine was more about experiencing emotional states than satisfying hunger, but theory and practice were proving to be vastly different things. He placed the cube on his tongue and immediately tasted something that could only be described as vanilla pudding mixed with the feeling of finding money in old pants pockets. He paused, searching for diplomatic phrasing while his taste buds tried to process the concept of edible happiness. Unexpectedly nostalgic. Minister Vexthala's ears perked up with delight. Ah, you have accessed the memory resonance. Most humans experience it as comfort food from their youth. The temporal crystals capture moments of pure contentment from across the galaxy. So I'm eating concentrated happiness that someone else felt. When, exactly? Oh, about 3,000 years ago, I believe. A child from the Andromeda sector discovering ice cream for the first time. David nodded slowly, trying to appear worldly while processing the fact that he was experiencing the emotional afterglow of some alien child's dessert revelation from millennia past. Of course, how efficient. Sarah appeared at his elbow, looking frazzled and clutching her malfunctioning data pad like a security blanket. Sir, I've managed to decode some of the cultural protocols, but I think I may have accidentally agreed to a trade alliance involving our atmospheric processing rights in exchange for decorative moss. Decorative moss. It translates better as consciousness-enhancing atmospheric symbionts, but my implant keeps defaulting to moss. Also, I'm fairly certain I proposed marriage to someone's pet. David glanced around the reception hall, where various Zephyrian nobles engaged in conversations that seemed to involve as much ear positioning as actual words. Near the quantum fountain, which he'd learned was actually a three-dimensional poem about the nature of existence, he spotted High Curator Zilnath attempting to explain something to a bewildered-looking member of his security detail. The temporal displacement field is perfectly safe, Zilnath was saying, his ears rotating in what David had begun to recognize as pedagogical enthusiasm. It simply allows you to experience the fountain's meaning from 17 different points in its history simultaneously. The security officer, a no-nonsense woman named Lieutenant Tors, stared at the fountain with the expression of someone whose training had covered many contingencies, but not multidimensional poetry. Sir, my orders are to ensure the ambassador's safety. I'm not sure how to protect him from metaphysical implications. Perhaps you could shoot the abstract concepts if they become threatening, suggested Curator Zilnath helpfully. David decided to rescue Tors before the conversation devolved further into armed philosophical debate. Lieutenant, I think we can consider the fountain friendly. It hasn't tried to critique my diplomatic credentials yet. Sir, with respect, we've been here 2 hours and you've been mocked by architecture, fed temporal emotions, and I'm pretty sure that plant over there has been following you. David looked where she pointed. Indeed, a small flowering vine had been trailing him since he'd entered the reception hall, occasionally offering him what appeared to be glowing berries, while humming in harmonious counterpoint to the conversations around it. That's Melody, said a voice behind him. She's drawn to interesting emotional resonances. David turned to find Queen Lysara approaching, her presence causing the surrounding conversations to shift into more formal registers. The living vine immediately perked up, extending a tendril toward the queen with obvious affection. Your Majesty, David began, then watched as Melody wrapped gently around his wrist and began playing what sounded suspiciously like a love song. I seem to have acquired a musical admirer. Melody is quite selective, Queen Lysara observed, and David caught the subtle amusement in her tone. She typically only bonds with individuals who possess particularly complex emotional spectrums. I'm not sure whether to be flattered or concerned that a plant finds my feelings interesting enough to serenade. In Zephyrian culture, being chosen by a melody vine is considered quite auspicious. They're excellent judges of character. David looked down at the vine, which had now begun harmonizing with the ambient sounds of the reception, while occasionally offering him berries that tasted like musical notes. "Well, Melody, I suppose if you're going to follow me around, we should at least be properly introduced." The vine responded by playing what he could have sworn was a tiny fanfare. Queen Lysara's ears tilted forward, and David realized this was the first time he'd seen her genuinely relaxed since his arrival. Away from the formal ceremony, she seemed less like an untouchable sovereign and more like someone who found genuine delight in the absurdities of interspecies diplomacy. "Ambassador, perhaps you would join me for a moment away from the crowd?" she asked. "I find that formal receptions, while necessary, sometimes obscure the more meaningful aspects of cultural exchange." They moved toward an alcove overlooking the city, where floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the sprawling bioluminescent landscape below. The twin suns were setting, casting the living spires in warm amber light that seemed to pulse with the city's collective heartbeat. "It's beautiful," David said, and meant it. "I've visited dozens of worlds, but I've never seen anything quite like this. Your people didn't just build a city, you grew one." "The distinction between growth and construction is less clear for us than it might be for humans," Queen Lysara replied. "We work in partnership with our environment rather than imposing our will upon it. The city reflects our collective consciousness, our hopes and dreams made manifest in living crystal and responsive light." David noticed that her ears had relaxed from their formal positioning, settling into more natural angles that somehow made her seem more approachable. Melody, still wrapped around his wrist, had begun playing a soft accompaniment to their conversation, as if providing a soundtrack for the moment. "It must be incredible, living in such harmony with your surroundings," he said. "On Earth, we're still learning how to coexist with our environment instead of dominating it." "Harmony isn't always as simple as it appears," Queen Lysara said quietly, her gaze fixed on the city below. "When your emotions are reflected in your surroundings, when your feelings ripple through the consciousness of your people, privacy becomes a luxury few can afford." There was something wistful in her tone that made David look at her more closely. In the soft light from the city, he could see the subtle tension in her shoulders, the way her ears drooped almost imperceptibly when she thought he wasn't looking. "That sounds lonely," he said gently. Her ears snapped upright, and for a moment he worried he'd overstepped some cultural boundary. But then they settled again, and she turned to meet his gaze with something that looked almost like surprise. "Loneliness is not a concept we discuss often in our culture. Individual emotional states are considered less important than collective harmony. But you still feel it." She paused, as if the admission were something she'd never voiced aloud. "Yes. Sometimes the burden of being the emotional center of our people means there's no space for personal feelings, no room for uncertainty or doubt or just wanting to be seen as yourself rather than as a symbol." Queen Lysara's ears rotated toward him with sharp attention, and he realized he'd struck something deeper than he'd intended. Around her wrist, her own melody vine began to glow more brightly, responding to the intensity of her emotions. "How did you?" she began, then shook her head. "Your species has an unusual gift for perceiving emotional truth. Or maybe I'm just familiar with the weight of expectations," David replied. "Different scale, maybe, but the feeling's universal." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the city's lights shift and dance in response to the dreams of its inhabitants. Melody had begun harmonizing with Queen Lysara's vine, creating a duet that seemed to bridge the space between them. "You know," David said eventually, "when I was being briefed for this mission, they warned me about your people's beauty. They said it was otherworldly, dangerous to human psychology." Queen Lysara's ears flicked upward, in what he was learning to recognize as curiosity mixed with wariness. "But they never mentioned how genuine you are," he continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper as he studied her profile against the alien constellations. "How real you seem, despite all the ceremony and protocol. You're not just beautiful, you're genuinely beautiful. The words slipped out before he could catch them, honest and unguarded in a way that went against every diplomatic instinct he'd ever learned. The silence that followed seemed to stretch across light years, broken only by the soft harmonics of their melody vines and the distant hum of the living city below. Queen Lysara's ears flushed a deep violet at the tips, the color spreading slowly as her composure cracked like morning ice. For one suspended moment, she wasn't a sovereign or a symbol. She was simply someone who had perhaps never been told she was beautiful for who she was rather than what she represented. She began, then stopped, her hand moving unconsciously to touch one of her ears as if checking whether the blush was visible. David felt his heart sink as he realized what he'd done. In his moment of genuine connection, he'd forgotten every protocol, every cultural briefing, every warning about the delicate nature of first contact diplomacy. "Your Majesty," he started to apologize, but she held up a hand, still not meeting his eyes. "I think," she said quietly, her voice carrying a tremor he'd never heard before, "I think I need a moment." As she turned to leave, David caught a glimpse of her expression, not anger or offense, but something far more complex and infinitely more dangerous. Wonder, confusion, and the dawning realization that something fundamental had just shifted between them, with implications that neither of them was prepared to face. David woke to the sound of what could only be described as cosmic hiccups. His quarters, if luxurious imprisonment could be called quarters, pulsed with gentle amber light that seemed determined to match his circadian rhythms despite having no idea what those might be. The walls, which had spent the night learning his preferences through some form of architectural telepathy, had thoughtfully adjusted themselves to display a simulation of Earth's sky, complete with clouds that occasionally looked apologetic. "Good morning, Ambassador Kellner," came Chancellor Thyron's voice, projected directly into his consciousness with the kind of formal politeness usually reserved for funeral directors. "I trust you slept well despite the atmospheric disturbances." David sat up, realizing that the cosmic hiccups were actually coming from outside his window. The city below was experiencing what appeared to be synchronized emotional spasms, with buildings flickering between colors like a malfunctioning aurora and the bioluminescent streets pulsing in irregular patterns. "Chancellor, what exactly is happening out there? It looks like your city is having some kind of seizure." "That, Ambassador, is precisely why we need to discuss the events of last evening. It seems your interaction with Her Majesty has created certain ripple effects throughout our bio-neural network." A soft chime announced the arrival of breakfast, delivered by a floating platform that seemed distinctly nervous, bobbing erratically as it approached. The meal itself appeared to be trying to escape the plate, with several items exhibiting what could only be called agitated behavior. "Is my food supposed to be doing that?" David asked, watching a piece of what looked like crystallized sunlight hop around like a caffeinated cricket. "The temporal essence cubes are responding to the network fluctuations," Thyron explained, his mental voice carrying undertones of diplomatic strain. "They're experiencing emotional contamination from recent events. I'm told they taste rather flustered this morning." David cautiously bit into one of the cubes and immediately experienced the sensation of butterflies in his stomach, except the butterflies seemed to be experiencing their own butterflies, creating a recursive loop of nervousness that made his head spin. "This is awful," he said, then quickly added, "I mean, diplomatically speaking, this is a concerning development that we should address through proper channels. Indeed, the High Council has requested your presence for an emergency session. Apparently, 3 ministers have been found blushing uncontrollably. The palace guard is experiencing unprecedented levels of romantic confusion, and the municipal transportation system has begun playing love songs instead of efficiency announcements." David groaned. "How bad are we talking?" "Well, the The quantum fountain has composed 17 new poems about unspoken longing. 2 diplomatic envoys from neighboring sectors have inquired whether we're experiencing a cultural renaissance or a mental breakdown. And the central bioprocessor that manages our weather patterns has been sighing dramatically every few minutes, causing what our meteorologists are calling wistful precipitation. Through his window, David could indeed see that it was raining, though the droplets seemed to be falling in unusually poetic patterns, and he could have sworn he heard them making small melancholic sounds as they hit the crystal walkways. So what you're telling me is that my compliment to your queen has somehow infected your entire civilization with feelings. That would be a remarkably crude, but essentially accurate assessment, yes. A new voice joined the conversation, crackling with static and what sounded suspiciously like giggling. Ambassador, this is Sarah. Are you receiving me? My communicator keeps translating everything I say into romantic poetry, and I think I've accidentally declared eternal devotion to a maintenance droid. Sarah, where are you? Confined to quarters, same as you, but mine keep trying to redecorate themselves into what I can only describe as ambient romance. The walls are playing soft music, and the lighting keeps dimming suggestively. I asked for a glass of water and got champagne bubbles that spell out, forever when they pop. David rubbed his temples, feeling the beginnings of what promised to be a truly interdimensional headache. Chancellor, I think we need to have that emergency meeting sooner rather than later. Agreed. However, I should warn you that transport to the council chambers may be unusual this morning. The bioneural network's emotional state has affected all of our systems. The platform that had delivered his breakfast suddenly sprouted what appeared to be flower petals around its edges and began humming a tune that sounded remarkably like a wedding march. When David stepped aboard, it immediately began swaying in a way that suggested it was experiencing the floating equivalent of weak knees. The journey to the council chambers became an exercise in navigating a city-wide case of emotional intoxication. The walkways had developed a tendency to glow wherever 2 people stood close together. The architectural lighting system kept dimming and brightening in what appeared to be cosmic flirting. Chancellor, David said carefully, what exactly happens if your network can't integrate these new emotions? We're not entirely certain. Our bioarchitects suggest several possibilities, ranging from a complete restructuring of our social order to the possibility that our collective consciousness might fragment entirely. Meaning we might accidentally evolve individual personality development, overnight, for an entire planetary population. David stared at him. That's either the most beautiful thing I've ever heard or the most terrifying. From our perspective, there's very little difference between the two right now. The council chambers had been transformed into something that looked like the aftermath of an explosion at a romance novel factory. The usually pristine bioluminescent walls were pulsing in warm, golden hues that seemed to pulse in rhythm with a massive collective heartbeat, while the ceremonial seating arrangements had spontaneously reorganized themselves into more intimate configurations. The High Council members themselves presented a sight that David suspected would be remembered in diplomatic circles for centuries. Ancient beings who had spent millennia perfecting emotional equilibrium now sat with ears displaying the kind of color patterns typically associated with adolescent confusion. Minister Vexthala's floating ear jewelry had begun orbiting in heart-shaped patterns, while High Curator Zilnith appeared to be struggling with a case of what humans would recognize as butterflies in the stomach, if butterflies were interdimensional and made of pure nervous energy. Ambassador Kellner, began Elder Nyxara, the senior council member, her voice carrying harmonics that suggested she was fighting off a giggle fit. We find ourselves in a situation that requires immediate resolution. Our queen has been indisposed since your conversation last evening, and her emotional state is causing cascading effects throughout our planetary consciousness. How indisposed are we talking about? She has locked herself in the resonance chamber and is apparently experiencing what our cultural analysts can only describe as cosmic fluttering. The chamber's bioneural interface is amplifying her feelings and broadcasting them across the entire network. Our population is experiencing second-hand emotions they don't have names for, and 3 separate cities have reported that their architectural systems have begun spontaneously generating what appear to be love letters written in the arrangement of street lighting. David tried to process this information, while simultaneously trying not to laugh at the sight of the galaxy's most advanced civilization brought to its knees by what was essentially a planetary case of romantic confusion. "What do you need from me?" "We need you to speak with her," Elder Nyxara said, her ears drooping with what looked like embarrassment. "Our traditional methods of emotional regulation aren't working because these aren't traditional emotions. They're personal, individual. We don't have protocols for feelings that belong to one person rather than everyone. And if I make things worse—" "Ambassador," Chancellor Thyron interjected, his mental voice carrying grim humor, "our weather control systems are now generating heart-shaped clouds. Our transportation network is playing romantic ballads, and our central database has somehow learned to sigh. I'm not certain things can get significantly worse." As if summoned by his words, a low, wistful sound echoed through the council chambers. The city itself, sighing through its bioneural network with the sound of an entire civilization, discovering the exquisite torture of unrequited feelings. "Although," Theron added thoughtfully, "I suppose I should not challenge the universe to prove me wrong." The resonance chamber's doors parted like liquid starlight, revealing what David could only describe as the physical manifestation of emotional turmoil. The circular room pulsed with waves of bioluminescent color that shifted from deep violet to warm gold to nervous silver, while the air itself seemed to thrum with the kind of energy usually associated with thunderstorms and first dates. Queen Lysara stood at the chamber's center, her back to him, surrounded by floating holographic displays that showed the emotional cascade rippling across her planet in real time. Her ears, usually so perfectly controlled, drooped with exhaustion and something that looked remarkably like mortification. "Your Majesty," David began carefully, "I've been told you wanted to see me." She turned slowly, and David felt his breath catch. Her usual regal composure had been replaced by something raw and genuine, her ears flushed at the tips, her expression carrying the kind of vulnerability that came from having one's deepest feelings broadcast to an entire civilization. "Ambassador Kellner," she said, her voice carrying harmonics he'd never heard before, "I believe I owe you an apology. My reaction to your words has destabilized my entire world. Actually, I think the apology should come from me. I seem to have accidentally caused the first planetary case of romantic confusion in recorded history." A soft chiming sound filled the chamber as Queen Lysara's melody vine, which had been wrapped around her wrist, began playing what sounded suspiciously like nervous laughter set to music. "The Council has proposed a solution," she said, gesturing to the holographic displays. "Memory modification. A simple neural adjustment that would erase the incident from both our minds, restore my emotional equilibrium, and return our bioneural network to its previous state of collective harmony." David studied the technical readouts, which looked like someone had tried to diagram feelings using mathematics and given up halfway through. That would solve the immediate crisis. Yes, within hours, our people would return to their normal emotional patterns. The weather would stop sighing, the transportation systems would resume playing efficiency announcements instead of love songs, and our architectural systems would cease their attempts at cosmic poetry. But Queen Lysara's ears tilted forward, and David caught a glimpse of the person she was becoming rather than the sovereign she'd always been. "But it would also erase the first time in my life that someone saw me, really saw me, as more than just a symbol or a role to be filled." The chamber's lighting shifted to warmer tones, responding to the change in her emotional resonance. And David realized that, for all the chaos his words had caused, they had also awakened something in her that she wasn't willing to lose. "Your Majesty, Lysara, what do you want? Not as a queen, not as the emotional center of your people's consciousness, but as yourself." Her ears flushed deeper violet, and she looked down at her hands, where her melody vine had begun playing a tune that sounded like hope mixed with terror. "I want to know what it feels like to be seen as beautiful rather than just appropriate. I want to understand these individual emotions that our society never taught me to recognize. And I want—" She paused, meeting his eyes for the first time since he'd entered. "I want to see what we might become if we're brave enough to let our people discover the same thing. Even if it changes everything. Especially if it changes everything." A new voice crackled through the chamber's communication system, tinged with the kind of exasperation usually reserved for parents dealing with particularly creative children. "Your Majesty, this is Minister Vexthala. I'm calling to report that the municipal fountains have begun proposing marriage to anyone who gets too close, and 3 of our most dignified cultural centers are apparently in the middle of composing a collaborative opera about the nature of attraction. Also, my floating ear jewelry has achieved sentience and is now giving me dating advice." David couldn't suppress a laugh, which caused Queen Lysara's ears to perk up with what looked like delighted surprise. "Minister," she responded, "please inform the council that we'll be implementing Protocol 7. "Protocol 7? Your Majesty, we don't have a Protocol 7. "Then we'll create it as we go. After all, we're apparently pioneering entirely new forms of consciousness. We might as well make up the procedures too." Another voice joined the conversation, crackling with static and barely contained giggles. "This is Sarah. I don't mean to interrupt what sounds like a historically significant moment, but my quarters have just achieved emotional symbiosis with me and are now crying because I mentioned missing Earth food. Also, I think I may have accidentally started a philosophical movement among the maintenance droids." "Sarah," David called out, "what kind of philosophical movement?" "They've apparently concluded that the meaning of existence can be found in properly calibrated atmospheric processing, and they've formed a support group. They're calling themselves the Enlightened Maintenance Collective, and they've begun leaving small gifts of perfectly balanced air filtration systems for anyone experiencing emotional distress." Queen Lysara covered her mouth, but David could see her shoulders shaking with suppressed laughter. "Ambassador, I believe your people are having a rather unusual effect on our civilization. The feeling is mutual. 3 days ago, I was a standard diplomatic envoy following established protocols. Now I'm apparently responsible for triggering the evolution of an entire planetary consciousness, and I'm having conversations with sentient architecture." The chamber's walls pulsed with what could only be described as architectural amusement, and David realized that the room itself had been following their conversation with interest. "So," he said, looking around at the responsive environment, "what exactly is Protocol 7 going to involve?" Queen Lysara straightened, and David could see her stepping into a new version of leadership, one that embraced uncertainty rather than hiding from it. "We're going to let our people learn what we're learning. Individual emotions, personal connections, the terrifying and wonderful experience of being seen and appreciated for who we are rather than what we represent." Her ears had stopped drooping and now stood alert, catching the chamber's shifting light. "It will be chaotic. It will probably be embarrassing. Our efficiency ratings will likely plummet while everyone learns to navigate feelings they've never experienced before. And it will be the most genuine thing our civilization has ever attempted." She moved closer, and David noticed that the melody vines wrapped around both their wrists had begun harmonizing, creating a duet that seemed to bridge the space between species. "Ambassador David Kellner, would you be willing to serve as cultural liaison for the most unprecedented social experiment in galactic history? You're asking me to help an entire planet learn how to have feelings. I'm asking you to help us discover what we become when we're brave enough to be individuals as well as a collective. David looked around the chamber, with its responsive walls and emotional lighting, then at Queen Lysara, whose ears were positioned in what he'd learned was hopeful expectation mixed with terrified determination. Your Majesty, 3 days ago I would have said that was impossible. Now, he gestured at the displays showing heart-shaped clouds and lovesick transportation systems. Now I'm pretty sure impossible is just another word for we haven't figured out the paperwork yet. Her laugh was like silver bells discovering harmony, and the chamber's walls responded with a gentle cascade of golden light that felt like the universe itself approving of their decision. There will be forms to file, she warned him. Lots of forms. Apparently, triggering species-wide emotional evolution requires extensive documentation. I've survived diplomatic bureaucracy before. How hard can interdimensional relationship paperwork be? 6 months later, David stood on the same crystal walkway where his gravity boots had first betrayed him, watching the city of Lithara pulse with new patterns of light. The buildings still responded to their inhabitants' emotions, but now those emotions were richer, more varied, tinged with the complexity that came from beings learning to be individuals within a collective. The municipal transportation system had settled into playing a mix of efficiency announcements and what the Zephyrians had dubbed emotional weather reports, while the fountains had developed a tendency to offer relationship advice that was surprisingly insightful for sentient water features. Queen Lysara approached, her ears decorated with new jewelry that David had learned was actually a gift from her people, tiny crystalline flowers that bloomed in response to genuine happiness. How did the council meeting go? He asked. 3 marriage proposals from visiting dignitaries, 2 requests to study our emotional evolution protocols from neighboring civilizations, and 1 formal complaint from the Rigelian Trade Alliance about our new habit of including poetry in our shipping manifests. And we've officially been designated as the galaxy's first experimental emotional development zone. Her ears tilted in what he now recognized as pride mixed with amused disbelief. We're apparently a case study in the benefits of diplomatic accidents. David laughed, causing Melody, who still followed him everywhere, to play a happy little trill that harmonized with the city's evening song. Any regrets? He asked. Queen Lysara considered this, her ears rotating thoughtfully as she looked out over her transformed kingdom. My people are still learning to navigate individual desires alongside collective responsibility. Our efficiency ratings have indeed plummeted, while everyone discovers the concept of having personal preferences. And yesterday, our weather control system achieved what I can only describe as artistic pretensions and decided to reign in iambic pentameter. That sounds complicated. It is. It's messy and unpredictable and absolutely nothing like the ordered perfection we maintained for millennia. She turned to him, her expression carrying the kind of quiet joy that came from choosing growth over safety. And David, yes, I wouldn't trade it for anything. For the first time in my life, when my people look at me, they see Lysara who happens to be queen, rather than a queen who happens to be named Lysara. Above them, the alien stars painted patterns across a sky that now occasionally rearranged itself into love letters written in constellations, while below, a civilization learned that the most profound revolutions sometimes began with the simple courage to tell someone they were beautiful.